Es un honor para Negocios Televisión poder contar hoy con la presencia online de Martin Wolf, es el Chief Economics Commentator en Financial Times. Martin, good morning.
Good morning.
You have described today's world as being a polycrisis. What do you believe in the most dangerous economic threat we face right now? War, debt, globalization, or something else?
Well, I think it's all these things together that makes the world so fragile. It's pretty clear we have had a series of enormous shocks going back to 2007, the global financial crisis, particularly more recently, even more of them, pandemic, post-pandemic inflation, the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, and now, of course, the Trump shock. Trump's, as it were, war against the world, and particularly against his country's allies. And this is occurring against the backdrop of profound structural changes in the world economy, the relative decline of the West, the rise of Asian economies in particular, as well as structural changes in politics, the greater fragility of democracy, the rise of the populist right, particularly in the West and notably in the United States. And behind that, even bigger changes going on, climate, which is completely unmanaged and, as it looks at the moment, unmanageable. If you start seeing the interaction of all these things, the world looks increasingly unmanageable, even ungovernable, and the time horizons for policymakers are increasingly short at just the time when we need long-term policy and long-term policy decisions. And that, I suppose, is a very brief summary of this idea of a polycrisis.
The war in Ukraine has deeply shaken Europe. Economically speaking, do you think it marks the beginning of long-term decline in Europe's global competitiveness?
Well, it's certainly not the beginning. This goes back quite a long way, but it was a very important change because it shifted or has shifted relative energy prices against Europe. Again, that's been true to some degree for a long time. Europe is energy dependent. The United States is energy independent. It's indeed largely resource independent. And that has become a very decisive advantage for American manufacturing. But there are other big transformations, which I think are probably more important. And I would stress in particular the competition from the United States in the area of digital technology, the most advanced technology, where Europe has fallen ever further behind over decades. And I would also stress the rise of China as the world's largest manufacturing power and increasingly at the forefront of technology, notably again in digital technology, but very important for Europe, also in motor vehicles, in the new clean technologies of all kinds. So Europe is being squeezed very mercilessly, but this isn't about the war in Ukraine, which is of course not insignificant, but it's about a much longer term history of decline, which Mario Draghi described very, very well in his well-known report.
This report is hidden now for Europe. Do you think this is the most important problem from Europe now, that all the effort about to change the things could be hidden for European Union?
I think there are now two major challenges, enormous challenges. One is industrial and economic competitiveness, and this is very much what Mario Draghi focused on, and it's reviving economic dynamism, getting Europe once again to be at the forefront of technology. An immense challenge is, of course, hugely important. But this is also linked with two other things that I've already mentioned. One I haven't really mentioned fully, so it needs to be stressed now, which is the security challenge for Europe, that increasingly it looks as though the alliance with the United States is more unreliable, that Europe has to look after itself. This is obviously possible, but it's a profound transformation in the mindset of Europeans, that they will have to spend more money and they will have to have bigger armed forces to defend themselves against possible threats, notably from Russia. And the final challenge, broader still, is of course how Trump is rearranging the world in the area of trade. He's starting a trade war with Europe, for example. He's making very powerful demands for change in Europe, most of them quite unacceptable. So the challenges for Europe from the external environment in terms of long-term economic dynamism, in terms of security, and in terms of the broader relationship with its most important ally, the United States, are really, I think, in combination, unprecedented since the Second World War.
Some fear we are heading toward a new Cold War, this time economic, between United States and China. Can Europe stay neutral in this confrontation, or will it be forced to pick a side?
That's a very good question. Well, first of all, it's not completely clear how this confrontation is now going. There are many in Mr. Trump's administration, and there are many in America who do indeed regard China as the great threat, and really, particularly in the Republican side, want to decouple from China. It's actually not at all clear to me that that's true of Trump himself. He wants adjustments in trade relations. He wants the Chinese bilateral trade surplus to disappear. But he seems rather pro Mr. Xi. He admires dictators in general, and Xi Jinping is the world's most powerful dictator, so he admires him. It's very clear he does. Whether he is actually interested in a full-on Cold War or even worse with China is not at all clear to me. It's just like many other things with Trump, not clear. But either way, Europe is obviously in a very, very difficult position. My own view is that Europe has to seek as much independence as it can, but that doesn't mean cutting itself off from either the US or China, which would be, I think, an enormous strategic blunder politically and economically. It needs to retain good relations with the US, but it cannot, I think, cut itself off altogether from China, which is a great power, almost certainly, I think, going to continue to rise in the medium to long run, and leaving, as it were, being in conflict with China, trade conflict, economic conflict, is likely to be very, very costly for Europe in terms of economic opportunities in the long run. But I suppose if it's absolutely forced to choose, I would still tend to say, for the moment, we should choose the United States, because in the end, we have more in common with it. But that's very conditional today. It depends very much what happens in the politics of America, whether Trump is the new America forever, or whether it will revert to a more normal relationship with its principal allies, as would no doubt be the case if the Democrats won. So try to avoid choosing, have our own, Europe should have its own independent path in all the dimensions I've talked about. If it absolutely has to choose, I suppose it should choose the US, but I think it should do everything in its power to maintain reasonable relations with both sides and indeed with the rest of the world.
Are you looking at full-scale trade war, or this typical now taco trade? What do you think?
Well, the idea of the Trump always chickens out trade, the taco trade, which you cite, was of course put forward by my wonderful friend and colleague, Robert Armstrong. So I have to believe in it, don't I? Since it came from one of the most distinguished columnists of the Financial Times. Now, Rob Armstrong was telling us what he sees, that Trump makes big demands and then he backs down. Of course, Trump sees this as part of his negotiating strategy, and we don't know whether we should say he's chickening out or he's just continuing to negotiate. And that gets to the question of where Trump will really end up in his trade policy, if he ends up anywhere. Maybe it will be like this for years. I think the honest answer is we do not know. We do not know where he's going with this. We don't know whether he has a clear end game. And so if I were asked, from what I've seen, what will America's trade policy look like a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, during Trump's term, I really think the only answers are, one, it will be more protectionist for sure than it was under Biden, indeed more protectionist than it has been at any period since the Second World War. That is quite clear. That's one thing. Second, we don't know how protectionist it will be, and we don't know how variable it will be, how unpredictable it will be. Will it ever settle down or continue with this chaos? So those are the two things we don't know. It will be more protectionist, but we don't know how much more protectionist, and we don't know how unstable it will be. So the taco trade doesn't predict what's going to happen next. It just predicts that he'll never go to the absolute extreme, which I think is right. So this is a time of high uncertainty in trade relations with the US for everybody.
You have long warned about rentier capitalism, is the current version of capitalism falling in the middle class in Western democracies, and what comes next if it does?
I don't know what comes next, but if we look at the politics of our countries, there is essentially two choices: a revived liberal democracy, which is more credible for the majority of our people culturally, politically, and economically, though a revived liberal democracy of, broadly speaking, the center-right and center-left, or the populist right, the nationalist populist right. That looks at the moment to be the choice. The extreme left looks very weak almost everywhere in the Western world. So the two rivals that I've mentioned, the two possibilities, seem to be the ones almost everywhere. And then you realize it's all very country specific. How exactly that might play out looks very, very country specific. In Poland recently, we've had an election which shows how evenly divided the country is. It's very similar in the United States. In Germany, the center-left and center-right is still the majority pretty clearly. We don't know the future for France. I'm not going to comment on Spain because that will be incompetent and irresponsible. But that's the fight we have. And for the future of liberal democracy, the question is whether the center-left and center-right can create a set of policies and achievements which make the majority of the people feel that the sort of politics we've had now for many decades in our countries will last and will work. And that's the challenge. And I think because it's such a huge challenge, we don't know how it's going to end up.
What do you think how the central banks are acting during the last years at the beginning of the crisis of inflation And what do you think about these central banks now under pressure, for example, United States, Jerome Powell, and the pressure of the debt as a problem to manage this solution of crisis?
Well, that's a big set of questions. I think the central banks made a mistake in not starting to tighten monetary policy as soon as we came out of the pandemic. Monetary policy during the pandemic was understandably extraordinarily expansionary, and that created an extraordinarily strong recovery from the pandemic. Demand, I think, grew too fast, and that was at least a part of the reason for the inflation. It wasn't just energy prices. But once that became obvious in 2022, I think the central banks have handled it pretty well. They've managed to keep inflation expectations under control. We've got back pretty well to target inflation. That has been achieved with really very limited increases in unemployment, and in the United States in particular, very strong economic growth. I don't believe the weak growth of the EU and the Eurozone economy, the UK economy, is fundamentally due to monetary policy. It's got deeper reasons for it. So I would say the central banks have not done too badly. Given the scale of the shock the pandemic turned out to be, particularly along with the Russia-Ukraine war. It's perfectly clear, second, that central banks are under a lot of pressure for several reasons. One, the situation we're now in, for the reasons we discussed right at the beginning when we're talking about the poly crisis, is very complicated politically and economically. And that makes seeing the future really hard. And if you can't see the future, it's very difficult to work out what monetary policy should be, because the world is almost definitely going to give you surprises. And the policies you make now, the policy decisions you make now, will affect the world that you're interested in a year or two from now. So you're always dealing with an uncertain future, and it's particularly uncertain. Second problem, the politics are so difficult because we have very populist politics, and that is creating huge uncertainty in the economy, in international trade, investment prospects, and so forth, which affects economies now. And that makes life particularly difficult for central banks. And finally, as you mentioned, we are in a time, particularly in the US, but not uniquely, where public debts are very high, but interest rates have risen from the very low levels of the period from the financial crisis to about 2000. The interest rates were very low, short and long term. That made managing all this debt very easy. Now, interest rates are higher. That makes short-term borrowing more expensive and longer-term borrowing more expensive. This debt problem debt cost burden seriously affects fiscal positions. The budgets are very, very under stress. And of course, that puts pressure on central banks to lower interest rates. The politicians demand low interest rates. You can see this in America now. But the central banks don't want to give it because they're frightened that there will be an explosion of inflation with these huge fiscal deficits, and they will lose credibility. So obviously, for all these reasons, central banks are in real trouble.
The war in Ukraine has accelerated Europe push for energy independence and defense spending. Do you see this as an historical turning point or just a reactive phase?
Well, I would like it to be a historic turning point, but it's going to be very difficult because it's going to be very expensive. There are two forms of independence that are in question here. First, energy, and or perhaps first security and second energy, or maybe it's the two are together. One is economic, one is more about defense. And we've already discussed the necessary conditions for getting those things to work. And obviously that will involve pretty big decisions about allocation of public spending, taxation. If we're going to spend more on defense, something has to give, either higher taxes or some other spending. That's very, very difficult. Energy independence for Europe is clearly a long-term challenge. It's not something that we can turn on. The reality is that the fossil fuel resources of Europe are very limited. We're very far from a completely clean energy-based energy system. It's going to take the very best will in the world, way over a decade, way over, to get anywhere close to full energy independence. And of course, that means we are dependent on oil and gas, mostly from the Middle East, maybe again in future, conceivably from Russia, but not in the near future, or from the US, which has great costs associated with it. And it also appears that the public of Europe, partly because it's very expensive, are not very happy about expanding nuclear energy. So I tend to the view that energy independence is a mirage for the foreseeable, for the next 10 or 15 years. It will require a lot of investment if we're going to get anywhere close to that, a lot of policy reform, integrating energy markets across Europe, which we don't have now. I know this very well from Spanish experience with France. We won't get to a nirvana of cheap energy. We are no longer a cheap energy continent, and that affects our economy and public policy, I think, for the indefinite future. It's not a problem we can solve. It's only something we can manage.
Only one question more. If you could redesign the global economic system today, post-COVID, when arrive post-Ukraine, and amid climate crisis, what will be the first principle you will build it on?
Oh, that's a very big question. I suppose my answer would be, first, recognize the value of the institutions of global cooperation, the multilateral institutions, and all of the machinery that allowed countries to cooperate. We have to recognize the value of those, and we have to sustain them. Second, we must also recognize the world is different from what it was when these were designed. So we ought to have quite significant reforms of many of these institutions. I can't go into that in detail, but I can think of reforms in the trading system, reforms of governance, and in the latter category, a crucial thing is for the Western powers to recognize that the new powers of the world, the global South, China, India, must have a bigger say. It's just reality. We can't expect the West to continue to dominate all these institutions and for them to remain legitimate. That's a fundamental thing. And the third is we have to improve our domestic politics. The global economy ultimately depends on national sovereign states. And these sovereign states have to function effectively as outward-looking democratic communities, or at least stable communities which are able to cooperate with other countries. Now, we can't determine what Russia will do in the future or what China will do, but we can determine what we do. And it is clear that we have failed to keep our societies together while the world has changed so dramatically. The world will not stop changing because we want it to change. We have to change. And so the third big challenge is to domestic politics. So those are the three big challenges. Keep the world together, reform international institutions, reform domestic politics.
Thank you very much for having this time with us. Martin Wall, Chief Economic Commentator at Financial Times. Good day, good business, Mr. Wall.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure.
It was a great pleasure. Fue un placer también para nosotros.